Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is African Americans in World War II, Part 1. We're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you go to read more and learn more about the experiences, the varied experiences that Black Americans and their communities had in the U.S. and deployed really all over the world during World War II, that it's important for you to kind of center in on, focus in on, to get a better sense of the experiences. So the first is segregation and Jim Crow. So right after Pearl Harbor is bombed, December 7th, 1941, within days you have declarations of war from Hitler, you have declarations of war from the United States, you have this effort being undertaken by the United States to combat the Axis powers. There's this sense of unity, at least in public, right? Of a big, strong public outpouring of support for the American war effort, really regardless of race, class, or gender. The reality, of course, was that while the public face of this war effort may have been on paper, totally unified, an equitable response to this war. America is good, therefore, they are bad, and Nazis, of course, are bad. But it doesn't mean that the United States made the decision once the war began to do away with the iniquities that existed within its society. And so, of course, during World War II, segregation is still alive and well, both in the American South and across the country. Jim Crow laws existed throughout the country, and many Black service members especially experienced public humiliations as it became clear that their position in the service did little to nothing for them in the face of white individuals in positions of power. That brings us to our second point, which is Dory Miller. So you did, of course, have Black Americans who served with distinction, many thousands of Black Americans who served with distinction during the war. But it's, of course, important for us to note that they served in segregated forces and in many cases were restricted from service in combat arms. And an example of that would be Dory Miller, who was in the Navy, who, if you've ever seen the Hollywood film Pearl Harbor, becomes an incredibly famous and important character because of the fact that he's in the Navy, he's restricted from a combat arm, but on the morning of December 7th, finds a gun and begins firing, and is eventually awarded a medal for this, although, of course, is denied the Medal of Honor. There's a great debate over the role that race played in that, obviously. And then Miller dies, of course, in 1943, but his heroic actions in the morning of December 7th were incredibly important and were noteworthy, and were seen as this, in some ways outlier, but, to the norm of keeping Black men out of combat arms. Our third point would be the Double V campaign. So you do have a culture and climate of Jim Crow processes that existed during World War II for Black Americans. And so what you had was an effort on the part of the Black press, largely the Pittsburgh Courier and others, that attempted to highlight this in different cases and situations of the iniquities that existed. So if you're, say, a German POW who is white, you can go in and sit at a lunch counter that is for whites only, while the Black U.S. service member who is the guard has to stand outside or cannot have their meal there. Fourth, Detroit. Racial violence does occur in the U.S. during World War II. particularly by the time you get into 1943, you've got things like the Zoot Suit riots, but you also have racial violence where white leaders and others are seeking to maintain and impose white supremacy, and you see these brutal actions by white communities against black neighborhoods and others. This occurs in Detroit in the summer of 1943. Fifth term for us, or fifth concept for us, would be race in the UK. So once you have thousands and thousands of black men, especially, who are joining the US military, many of them are going to be deployed overseas, largely to England in the years leading up to D-Day. And this was a process whereby the US military, being a segregated institution, sought to maintain Jim Crow structures in England in the years leading up to the war. So attempting to work actually with local English populations to create racially segregated laws in those areas so that white service members, for example, didn't have to associate with non-white service members and this kind of thing. Add into this an element of stereotypes and sexuality, and you have a reality for especially black male service members in the UK and then eventually in France, whereby many of them are working in positions of supply. They're working behind the lines. They're often around the civilian population. And you have this really racist and brutally discriminatory view in the early 1940s that essentially black men are seeking out white women in order to carry out acts of sexual violence. So you have this reality where black men become targets on the part of the sort of judicial process at the time, where if there are accusations of rape, often they are placed against black men, U.S. service members, and more often than not, a black male service member is more likely to be, if they're accused of rape, they're more likely to be charged, they're more likely to be found guilty, they're more likely to be given much harsher punishments, and this was, the case certainly in the UK, but even far more so in France. All right, thank you very much.